Okay, so here you can see the web proxy responding to a simple request. I'm going to set up the proxy on port 10,001, and then I'm going to telnet in to that port, and I'm going to use the URL from the Python test script here so that you can see it return. So I'm going to demonstrate the caching here. So I've got two terminal windows open to the same directory, and you can see that because here there's no executables, but once I make in this terminal, you can see the executables here. Executable. And so I'm going to start the web proxy, and I'm going to start it on port 10,001 and give the cache timeout a value of 2 minutes just for the purposes of demonstration here. Another thing to note is that there's no cache folder in the directory right now, which will change once I start the web proxy. It creates a cache folder to hold the cached files. So I'm going to demonstrate this by telnetting in to the web proxy, and I'm going to use the URL from the Python test script. And so here we can see that the program is saying that it's sending the request to the server. So I'll send that same request back through my proxy, and it's going to return the cached file. And so what we can see is that if we actually view that cache folder, is that it's storing cached responses based on the MD5 of their URL. And so it looks this up every time it gets a request and determines whether there's a file in that cache folder or not. If there is, it simply returns it. If there isn't, or if it has expired based on the cache timeout, it sends a request to the server again. Okay, so I'm going to demonstrate the cache timeout here. So I'm going to start my web proxy on port 10,001 and set the timeout to be 1 second. So I'm going to configure my browser to look at the proxy on localhost at port 10,001. And then I'm going to go to the URL that was provided in the Python test script that that script used to run. So you can see here it's sending a request to the server. And if I go ahead and try and get that same page again, it's going to send a request to the same server since it's been over 1 second. I'm going to start my proxy on port 10,002. Oh, you know what? I'm going to start it 10,001, and I'm going to specify that the cache timeout be 2 minutes, just so that we can, for purposes of demonstration here. So I'm going to show here that we have a cache folder and that it is empty currently. So I'm going to make sure that my browser is configured to use the proper port and localhost, and then I'm going to use these URLs which come from the Python test script that was sent out. So first of all, you can see here it's sending multiple requests to the server. Multiple requests actually from the browser here. But if I go and demonstrate in the cache folder, there's many more than that were sent to the server here. And so if I go then and click on this one, Kevin and, you can see that we get returning a cached file, which shouldn't be the case if I haven't visited that. This error right here is because that domain name is no longer valid. But anyways, so yeah, here we can see that the prefetching works, that the cached file is returned despite never having gone to that page. Okay, so I'm going to demonstrate multi-threading here. So I'm going to start my proxy on port 10,001. Okay, so then what I'm going to do here is I'm going to telnet in to the port. Okay, so it's connected. Then I'm going to go into another tab, and I'm going to telnet in to the same proxy, and so I'm also connected. So what you can see here is that I'm connected in both tabs with only one instance running. Now what I'm going to do is send this request, which came from the Python test script. And I can see there that I got it. And I've enabled the viewing of the prefetching responses here, so you can see that all these requests are being sent and that it's continued. So after I get this value, after I get this response, there's still things being returned. So those two connections were made at the same time, which demonstrates multi-threading. Okay, so I'm going to demonstrate some basic error handling. So I'm going to start my web proxy on port 10,001. Then I'm going to telnet in to localhost on that port, and I'm going to send a seemingly valid request, except for I'm going to give the wrong, an invalid URL version, or HTTP version, sorry. So you can see that that's what the response is returned, that request. Then I'm going to do the same thing, spelling get wrong. And you can see that I get an invalid method error here. I'm going to do another one. I'm going to do post this time, a request or a command that wasn't supported by our proxies for this assignment. And you can see that it recognizes it's a valid method, but it's just saying that it's unsupported at this point. And then to demonstrate an internal server error, I'm going to not specify a URL here. And what's going to happen is when the proxy tries to parse the HTTP request, it's going to throw some errors, and so it's not going to even try to continue along with that request since it is unable to parse it. And so we can see here that that's what's returned to the client. Okay, so I'm going to give a basic overview of the code here. So here's the main function. Just do some basic logistical things right here, like setting up the proxy address, handling arguments, handling the cache timeout, and I actually set up the proxy socket here and start listening. Then I create a cache folder to hold the cache values that are going to be returned, or it's going to hold the cached requests to return back to the client. Okay, so then here we're going to start the while loop, and I'm going to start accepting connections, accepting client connections. Once I accept one, I fork, and the child here is going to handle the actual request from the client. If I'm not the child, then I'm going to close the client socket and accept another connection. This is how I handle multiple. Clients at one time and multi-threading. So here I'm going to receive from the client, and I'm going to parse an HTTP request, which this just means it's going to take this buffer of received data, and then it's going to create an HTTP request struct, which is something I define at the top of the file, and it just holds various strings like the command and the HTTP version, etc. And so that just helps me later to organize how I'm accessing the request information. So then here I handle request errors, so that might be an invalid method or an unsupported method. And so what I do is I send that request struct and the client socket, and what this function does is if it finds an error, it sends it to the client and then returns -1. Otherwise it returns 0. So here, if the request has errors, is 0, which it should be if the request is free of errors, then it will go ahead and actually handle that request. Otherwise, it's going to just end the child process. Okay, so and it doesn't have to send anything here because it had already sent it above. So this collect response function, which is going to be the meat of the handling of the request, essentially what it does is it returns a response, or an HTTP response in this res buffer right here. And then what it's going to do is it's going to send that to the client, and then later we're going to do some other things like prefetching, which I will get to later, but I want to talk about this collect response function because it's arguably one of the most important in this program. So what it does is it first creates the expected cache path, and what that means is that it does an MD5 of the full URL of the request, and then it looks for a file with that MD5 with that name. So the MD5 should be the name of the file, and it looks for that inside of the cache folder. If it finds it here using this access function, then it checks the cache timeout. And so there was a part right here that I was checking for the file age to be equal to the maximum value for a long, and that's what is returned here. And so I was setting it to not expired if the file age was the maximum, which is something that I realized was wrong when I was going through this, making this video, and so I took that out. That's not reflected earlier, but since none of those videos actually would have caused for a file age to be that long, then I don't think that it demonstrates any of the that it contributed to anything earlier on in this video. Okay, so if the file age is less than the cache timeout, then I set the file is not expired to 1, meaning that I can actually use this cached request or response. So if the file exists and it's not expired, then I go ahead and return the cache file. And here I just have a verbose flag to signal whether the server is going to print out this, or the proxy is going to print out this information, which I did for previous stuff in this video. Then what I do is I just essentially read from the cached file and send, I read that into the response buffer. Okay, and that's what gets sent to the client. Then right here, otherwise, if the file doesn't exist or if the file has expired, then I have to send a request to the server. And I go through this forwarding request to server function. Then I receive from the server and then into that response buffer, and then down here I actually write a new cache entry, so the next time that I request this address, I'll have a cached value. So I'm going to just briefly go over this function to forward request to server. Essentially what it does is it looks for a port in the request info that it's passed, and if there's no port, then it sets it to 80. Then down here it gets the address information for the domain and the port that were specified in that request up there. And so then it just does basic sending the request to the server after generating a request from that struct. It then sends that to the server. Okay, so that's essentially the collect response function. So now down here, after I collect the response, then I send it, and then I go into prefetching. And so in prefetching, what I do is I just look through the response here, and I look for any links. And if I find a link, then I'm going to actually send a request. So using that collect response function, I'm going to send a request to the link. And then in this collect response function, what it'll do is it'll handle caching, and so what it'll store that value in the cached folder. And so then when I actually make a request through the client, it'll have already been cached with the prefetching. Okay, and that's just a basic overview of this code.